Welcome, everyone. My name is Lori Prue, and I am the part-time managing director with the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance. And I also live with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. We are here today to bring together an expert or experts to help educate patients or people with lived experience of arthritis and other health conditions to learn about drug discovery and clinical trials in Canada. One of the things that we do with CAPA and also with our partner here, Creaky Joints Canada, or Global Healthy Living Foundation, is provide patient input, at least into the drug approval and reimbursement processes for prescription drugs. But to be able to do so, we thought it was helpful for others also to become knowledgeable about the steps in the process. And that process begins with discovering a new drug and the process of getting that drug through the different stages of clinical trials. So before we get started too much, I just wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Where I am located is on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Nation of the Algonquin peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. I know we all come from different places throughout Canada, or maybe more broadly. So I'd just like us all to take a few seconds here to reflect on the land you live, work, and play, out of respect to the Indigenous peoples where you're located. But I am located, so I'm referring to the Algonquin peoples because I'm in the place known as Ottawa. Feel free to do so in the chat, or just reflect on that personally. A little bit about CAPA, I guess, before we get started, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Adam Kegley, from Creaky Joints Global Healthy Living. So CAPA is a patient-driven and managed organization. Our board and even staff, such as myself, live with various forms of arthritis. So we offer education to help people manage their health and often fill important gaps in our Canadian healthcare system. We provide opportunities and capacity building opportunities like this so patients can get involved in sharing their views, their patient perspectives in decision-making processes. We also share those patient perspectives to a wide range of decision makers to support living a better life with arthritis. So that could be access to medications, better healthcare, or even social policies. And we also support people to get involved in research as patient partners. So that's a little bit about CAPA. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Adam to talk a little bit about Creaky Joints.
Thanks, Lori, and welcome to everyone indeed. My name is Adam Kegley, as Lori said, and I'm the Associate Director of Global Partnerships at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, or GHLF. Just a little bit about GHLF's mission. It's really to put chronic disease patients at the center of their own care by helping them and the people who care for them through education, advocacy, research, and support. Those are our four main pillars. We originally focused on inflammatory arthritis and have since expanded to include work on other chronic conditions like migraine, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, and many more, because we found that a lot of crossover was happening and a lot of people coming to our sites had multiple conditions and not just one. And there was a real need to address that. I won't go through everything on the screen here because there's a lot, I know, but I would like to highlight a few items in particular just to give you a flavor of what we do. We do have global digital communities like Creaky Joints, as Lori mentioned, which is available everywhere with tons of educational content and resources for free, and have additional specific sites dedicated to a couple countries in particular. We have Creaky Joints Canada in English and French, Creaky Joints Australia, and also Creaky Joints Espanol for Spanish-speaking communities. Patient Spot, as you'll see here, which is formerly Arthritis Power, is our omni-disease platform that acts as a research registry, disease monitoring, and resource distribution hub for patients. It's accessible worldwide for free as well, downloadable via your app store. This tool is really instrumental in gathering patient data and helping patients track their own data, while also supporting research, advocacy, and education efforts. In Canada, specifically as a highlight, we've created patient councils that help guide our advocacy and education efforts. We also, amongst other things, as Lori mentioned, we contribute contribute to those national approval processes for access to new and innovative treatments, just to make sure that the voices of those with chronic conditions are heard. And today, I'm really glad we're able to provide this presentation with our co-hosts on clinical trials. As Lori mentioned, we really have found that there's a lot of gaps in knowledge, as well as misunderstandings about clinical trials, which is perfectly normal, actually. And that's one of the many reasons we're so committed to supporting clinical trials and really improving them by addressing the concerns and needs of patients, debunking those myths and misinformation, and by guiding them through what we're calling our Global Patient Health Center as part of our dedication to improving the clinical trial experience. And of course, the goal today with our guest speaker is to really break down the world of clinical trials for all of you from A to Z. So thank you all again for joining us, and back over to you, Lori.
Great, thank you so much. And I mean, just a few housekeeping items, and then I'm just really going to pass it over to Dawn Richards, who is our expert here today. We'll be spending the bulk of our time hearing from her. So we'll be recording this webinar. You've likely, seen that notification as you've logged on, and uploading it to the Kappa and Cricky Joint YouTube channels for education purposes for the people who weren't maybe able to attend, so that it's there as a tool for people. And the webinar is intended for education, information, and communication only. It doesn't constitute medical advice, though Dawn will provide lots of great information where you can get some additional information about clinical trials. It's really something to always speak to your physician about. We'll be asking a couple of questions to our guest at the end, but you're encouraged to put your questions in the chat throughout. There will be an open question and answer period at the end. So feel free to do so throughout. And now over to introduce our guest. So Dawn Richards, PhD, is the founder of 502 Labs, and with a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles over the past 20 years. It's her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis in 2006 that started her journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. In her role at Clinical Trials Ontario, or CTO for short, and you'll likely see that throughout, Dawn is charged with executing on the strategic pillar of patient and public engagement. She's contributed to the literature and practice of patient engagement, including authorship with patient partners, recognizing patients as people with various skills who also lead fulfilling lives. And she is also volunteer vice president with CAP, or the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow Dawn to share hers, as she's got a presentation, and I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Adam and Lori, for the really kind welcome. And it's really my privilege to be here today to be chatting with you. So Lori has given a great overview of who I am and what I'm up to. I work for Clinical Trials Ontario, or CTO, part-time, as Lori mentioned. I work for some other organizations as well. I also want to recognize that I live, work, and play in Toronto, which has been the land that's belonged to peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and the Chippewa peoples for many thousands of years before I got here. And I really feel like it's my duty as someone who now gets to enjoy living and working here to learn from those peoples and to understand how they've respected the land for so long before I arrived here. So I'll just briefly tell you about Clinical Trials Ontario, and I want to let people know that while this organization is based in Ontario, what I'm going to talk to you about today is applicable all across Canada related to clinical trials. Lots of it is applicable to other places in the world too, but with confidence, I can tell you that it applies to what's going on in Canada because our clinical trials are regulated nationally by Health Canada. So the organization that I work for, CTO, basically is primarily funded by the government of Ontario. And really our role is to help make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. We do that in 3 ways: by streamlining many of the processes related to clinical trials, in the work I do, which is engaging with patients in the public to either help them be members of clinical trial research teams or to help them make informed decisions about participation. And then we promote Ontario as a place for organizations to do clinical trials. So we got 2 polls to start things out. This is to get you warmed up and interacting with us. And maybe I can ask that the first poll is launched, just to learn a bit more about if you've ever participated in a clinical trial. So go ahead and answer. Just curious what kind of maybe knowledge you have based on your participation, but just really curious if you've participated in a trial or not. So I'll just give you a minute to respond there. Okay, and hopefully everyone's had a chance to maybe respond. Why don't we share the results? So it looks like a few of you have, and the majority of you haven't, which is fine. Hopefully everybody can learn something new today. And then let's go to the second poll. So it's one thing if you participated or not, and let's see what you would rate your knowledge about trials as being. Can we launch that poll? So maybe you're like, clinical what? Like, that's why I'm here, dum-dum. I want to learn what these are. Maybe you know a bit, or you feel like you know a bit. And then there's like the experts out there. Hand me the slides. I'll get off the presentation, lady. I'm happy to do the presentation for you. So what's your level of knowledge here, folks? And we're actually going to come back to this question at the end just to see if you felt like you've learned something, because that's really helpful for us to know too. Okay, so let's check out the results here. And it looks like most of you feel like you know something about this topic. So, and then a few of you aren't quite sure about things. So again, I'm hoping that everybody can learn something from today's presentation. And as Lori mentioned, feel free to dump any questions along the way in the chat. I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to them as they're rolling in, just because I'm on a small screen and it's a little bit difficult, but we'll have time at the end either to get to as many of those questions as we can, or I can also commit to responding to them after the webinar if there's lots of questions. So I'll just put out a plug for Clinical Trials Ontario. The information that we have on the website, we have developed with patient and public partners. It's in English and French because we know we have an audience from all across Canada. There's lots of good resources. There's a glossary about trials there for you. And most of what I'm going to talk to you today about comes from a few of the sub-pages of the website. So here's a QR code if it's easier for you just to snap that off the screen. And again, I'm happy to share slides with people, happy to answer questions after the fact. Our website has some videos too for people because not everyone wants to read through things. So there's some short videos for people too. So I've been asked to start to talk to you a bit about how things go from being like these really early discoveries to actually being approved and available. As in our case, we're going to focus on drugs today. So the discovery, development, and preclinical research, like that's really where I started my career. So for those of you who know me on the call, I'm a big nerd. I'm an analytical chemist by training. And so early in my career, I did work in biotech where we were all about trying to find, actually at that time, antibacterials. And so I got a lot of experience in discovery and development and some preclinical research. And then as my career shifted, I guess I kind of moved down the pipeline. And while I don't work to do clinical trials, I work in the trial space. And so I've just kind of shifted along. this pipeline here. And then through my work at Kappa with Lori and others too, I help with some of the submission processes that we're allowed to provide input onto. So let's start off with this area of discovery and development. You know, when you think of the scientist in the lab with the white coat on, and they've got like beakers boiling and they've got test tubes and stuff, that's discovery and development. That's where you're looking at, different molecules, which you're hoping will one day be a drug. And you're hoping that you can learn more about specific diseases. Maybe you'll be able to even stop or cure that disease. Maybe you'll be able to slow the effects of that disease or reverse the effects of that disease. And so, like I said, you might have that picture in your mind of somebody who's looking at different molecules and they're testing them to see if they can be beneficial against a specific disease. They might not even come up with a new drug or a new molecule. They might actually look at existing treatments that are already out there that actually have unanticipated effects. And there's a couple big ones that come to mind, although this weirdly happens from time to time. One of the medications that's in the arthritis space, which you might know as Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine, that was actually originally developed as an anti-malarial drug. It wasn't developed for inflammatory arthritis. However, during World War II, when soldiers were sent to the Pacific Theater, they were provided with anti-malarial medications. And those who had inflammatory arthritis actually noticed that their arthritis did better when they started taking this anti-malarial drug. So that's a cool example of like, we developed a drug for something else, but it actually happens to have really good benefits for a different disease. Another really famous one is Viagra. It was not originally developed for how it is currently marketed. That was a side effect that was discovered along the way. So it's just very cool to think about, like, those are two examples, and there are other examples where drugs can be like repurposed, or they might be tweaked a little bit because they have different effects than originally intended. It's not always about drugs too. Sometimes it's about new technologies and different things, but we're mostly going to focus on drugs today. And what about that development side of things? So discovery is like really hypothesis driven. Let's check this out. Let's see what happens with this molecule. In terms of development, we start to look at things that starts to make you think more about the drug side of things and less just about the cool aspects of this thing as a molecule itself. So we'll start to look at, and again, this is still like at the bench. We're not in animals yet or anywhere near people. This is a long way out. We start to look at, and we can do this in experiments, how the drug would be absorbed by your system, how it would be distributed, maybe how it's metabolized. So we can take liver enzymes, for example, and metabolize a medication and see what that looks like, how long it takes, what it breaks it down into. And sometimes even with drugs, it's what they've been metabolized into that actually has the drug effect. It's not the actual drug that you take. And like how it's excreted or how much of it's excreted versus what goes into you. We'll also start to look at like the potential benefits of this drug on different diseases, and the mechanism of action is really like how it works. So what system in the body it has its big effects on, like does it stop some area of the body from talking to another area of a body, and then that changes like an inflammatory arthritis process, or how does it work exactly? That's the mechanism of action. We can start to look at like what kind of dose would we potentially give people? What would the best way to give the drug be? Like, would this maybe be in a pill form? Would it be in an injection form? How soluble is this thing? And we also will look at side effects and what's called adverse events. So these are things we don't anticipate necessarily happening. Sometimes we refer to them as toxicity. this is coming more to light now. We can also start to think about how different drugs affect different groups of people. So it's very well known, for example, in the cardiac space. Generally, drugs have been developed mostly in men or in males as a sex group. And so we found out that they actually work differently in females, and maybe that's no surprise to us, right? They're very different. Women have very different hormonal processes, etc. So this is important to consider early on as well. And we start to think about or do testing for what's called drug-drug interactions. And you've probably had experience with this at the pharmacy too. If your pharmacist tells you, you know, if you're on this, you can't take this because they'll interact with each other, not in a good way. And lastly, you know, does it work better than other drugs that are already out there? Because if it doesn't, there might not be a compelling enough case to continue in the very expensive development process for drugs. So that's like all the super cool nerdy stuff that's happening really early on at the bench, right? So maybe our hypothetical drug is looking really good in that discovery and development phase, right? And whoever's working on this decides like, we got to keep working with this. Like, this is really interesting. I think it could do good stuff for disease X. This is when things start to go into the preclinical phase. And I also want you to think about as we go along, just because something is done well in one area doesn't mean it will move on to these kinds of next phases here. We're going to talk a lot about that with respect to trials as well. The other thing that this doesn't really do a great job of showing is that this timeline is like over a lot of years. So keep that in mind too, that this research takes time and it often takes many, many years. So let's go to the preclinical research stage. This is where we start to look at the drug, our hypothetical drug, in cells. So if it's a drug for cancer, we might look at it in specific cancer cells that we grow in the lab. We might look at how it interacts with tissues from people that live with that disease. And we might even look at animal models. So maybe animals that have been developed to express the disease that this drug would be for. So I'm going to put out the warning. I'm not going to talk a ton about animal testing, but for some people, that's a difficult conversation. So if you want to put it on mute or if you want to skip that till we get to the trials part of thing, I totally respect and understand that. So preclinical research, as I mentioned, this is, sometimes you'll hear us say in vitro research. That basically means like in the test tube, outside of a body, so to speak. And in vivo, in this case, means that we're talking about studies in animal models. And the animals might be small animals, mice, rats. They might go up to fairly large animals that function more like people do. So I'll leave it at that for now. Preclinical research starts to provide us with more information about the type of dosing that we might use with our hypothetical drug. And it'll also start to illuminate more information about the toxicity, potential side effects, and things that we can expect with our hypothetical drug. And whoever is doing the studies will be making decisions based on the kind of data that they collect here about whether or not they want to move these compounds or these drugs into research in people. And this isn't a decision that's taken lightly. It's a decision where there's a lot of data that's been gathered to this point, and where the people doing the research and funding the research really feel that the benefit is going to outweigh the risk of starting to study this in people. So when a person or a company decides that they would like to take a drug that they're working on and do a clinical trial, and a clinical trial means this is a highly regulated experiment. It is a type of research that's done in people. They have to, in Canada, apply to Health Canada, who is our regulator, and they can't undertake any clinical trial until Health Canada has approved authorization to do so, as well as a number of other groups that review the potential clinical trial as well. So just really important to remember that these are highly regulated studies, and Health Canada plays a role in these. So let's go back to that kind of pipeline we talked about. Our hypothetical drug is chugging along. It looks like it's got some promise from our work in cells and tissues and our animal models. And we've decided that we're going to fund research to move this into people. So what are clinical trials, and what do these actually look like? So I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it's okay to reiterate that clinical trials are done in people, and they are experimental research. They are done to test specific health-related interventions, which is a fancy clinical trial speak way to say a therapy or a treatment. And we look at specific outcomes related to those interventions. And we design clinical trials really specifically to answer certain questions. So they might answer a question like, is the therapy safe for people? Does the therapy improve or cure disease or help people live longer with that disease than the current treatments that are available, if there are any treatments available? And does it help people feel better? Does it impact their quality of life? What does that look like? So I've mentioned a couple of times also that clinical trials aren't only done to test drugs, but that's just where we're going to focus today. It's a little bit easier, and then we just focus on one area versus the whole gamut here. But clinical trials are done to look at treatments or interventions on their own or in combination with others. So we'll focus on our hypothetical drug. But we could think about trials being done with devices like an insulin pump or a pacemaker, something like that. A new type of surgery, radiation therapy undergoes clinical trials. A new diagnostic procedure, maybe it involves like imaging or some type of X-ray, and even diet and lifestyle interventions can be tested in clinical trials as well. So why do we do these things, right? You may have got an inkling that we, as I mentioned, design them to answer specific questions. And that provides us with data about the intervention that's being tested. And that data is not only used by the people doing the trial, it's also used by a lot of other people or organizations who might be invested in what that therapy or intervention is doing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. It's going to be the people doing the research, right? And the people who maybe are funding the research, which is called the sponsor. They'll look at the data from the clinical trial and they'll decide, like, you know, are we going to move this thing forward to the next type of clinical trial? Can we afford to do that? Or does the data basically tell us, you know, we're not going to, and we're going to stop here? Health Canada, as a regulator, looks at the results from trials, and they will let the researchers and sponsors know, you know, if they can continue on to, for example, their next clinical trial, or if things are not looking great there. Healthcare providers look at the data from clinical trials to change how practice takes place. So clinical practice guidelines are often based on clinical trial data where there is data. Health technology assessment agencies like CADIT will look at clinical trial data to decide whether or not things go onto our formularies. Payers will look at that data to decide if it is viable for them to cover. So there's like all these different people who are actually really interested in trial data. As I mentioned earlier too, we design clinical trials to answer specific questions. And so clinical trials for drugs are set up in these different phases. And each of these phases is set up to answer specific questions with a certain number of people in them. They usually take a range of time. And these are kind of like, you can count on these phases happening, but sometimes you'll see, depending on the disease that's being studied, you might see these phases combined. So you might see a phase 1-2 trial, or you might hear of a phase 2A, 2B trial. Or in cancer, sometimes you might even hear of a phase 0 trial. So, without us getting into like all kinds of complicated specifics, I'm just going to kind of give you the 101 here. And that at least gives you an overview of what things look like generally and the kinds of questions that we're trying to answer in each of these different phases. So again, important to remember, just like when we think about that original pipeline of like discovery to preclinical to clinical trial, things that start out in phase 1 don't always make it to phase 4. And that can be for a whole pile of reasons, right? So we're going to pretend that we've got this amazing hypothetical drug and it's going to make it all the way to market, okay? But again, keep in mind, things don't always move from one phase to another. So let's start off with phase 1. So these are small studies, and that's because these are the first time often that these drugs have gone into people. And the goal here is to see, like, is this drug safe? And you'll remember up until this point, it hasn't been tested in people yet, but we've got a lot of data where we think, and the regulatory agency thinks, et cetera, that this is going to be safe to put into people. But we don't actually know until we put the drug into people what things actually look like. So we can try our best with animal models. We try our best with all these other experiments that we run, but really we don't know until it goes into people what this looks like. And so phase 1 trials are often done on what we call healthy participants. So these people don't often live with the disease that the drug is intended for. And we are looking at, like, is this safe to put in people? We have an idea of what the dose should be, but there will be some tinkering with dose. And we'll start to see what the side effects are if they're different from what we've anticipated before. So these people are really closely monitored. Sometimes they're brought into a facility and they stay in the facility while this is happening. Sometimes they're offered financial compensation to participate as well. And that's because they're taking a bigger risk than the subsequent participants if this thing keeps moving throughout the clinical trial process. So first in human, they're taking a bigger risk than other people out there. Small population because they're kept a really close eye on. And it's hard to say the length of time this takes because that's partly tied to how long it takes them to recruit people for this study, but generally not as long as some of the larger the larger trials that will happen as our drug continues from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. Okay, so our hypothetical drug has shown that it's safe. It's shown that there's not a substantially different side effect profile from what we've anticipated, and we've got the bucks to move it into a phase 2 clinical trial. So this is now in a larger population of people. It's usually the people that live with the disease for which the drug is intended, because here we want to see, does this thing do what it's supposed to do? And that's called efficacy. So does it work how it's supposed to with whatever the disease is that it's intended for? We're going to learn more about the dose, and we will continue to learn about side effect information the more people who are exposed to this drug. So we have a larger number of participants here. Just like in all phases of clinical trials, these folks are monitored carefully, and they've got access to, multiple ways to get help if anything goes wrong or if they have any questions. Whoops. And these generally take longer than phase 1 studies, but again, it depends on the kind of time to recruit people to these trials. And then here we are, this thing's got great results from phase 2, and we decide, and we've got the money to, and the resources to move this on to a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies generally are in large numbers of people. Again, you have to think about, like, if this is a rare disease, there's probably not thousands of people in the world that actually have that disease. So trials are going to look different in different populations, but here generally a larger population. Again, we're continuing to learn about side effect information. And here we're interested in actually how long the effects of this medication now last. So we know that it's safe. We know that it works against the disease for which it's intended, and we want to see how long those effects last. So large number of participants here, these generally take a longer time. And if you hear the abbreviation RCT, that stands for randomized clinical trial. And that's when we're looking at 2 or more kind of treatment arms, and we compare them to each other. So that's what we do in phase 3 trials. We compare one type of treatment against another type of treatment. If there's no current standard of care for a specific disease, the treatment might be the drug that we're interested, or the drug that we're studying, versus placebo. But if there is a standard of care for this disease, that would not be ethical for the trial to be designed against a placebo arm. So it would be designed against the current standard of care for whatever this disease is. So that's important to know. It's an important question for you to ask too, if you're really concerned that, you know, you might be exposed to placebo. And the last thing I want to mention here is, like, why do we randomize people anyway? So, and what does that mean? So that means that if you have signed up to be a participant in this phase 3 trial, you are assigned completely by chance to which arm you're going to be in. And the idea there is that we want to reduce the bias that results in the results through using a randomization method here. In some cases, for example, the people doing the trial they also don't know who's in which arm. And so that's also for the purposes of reducing bias for the results here too. So after phase 3 studies, the sponsor can actually apply to Health Canada for this to be approved and widely marketed. So I'm just going to briefly touch on this because there are trials that happen after things go on the market. Those are called phase 4 trials. But I know that the next webinar in this series is going to be a lot more about how things actually get approved by the regulatory bodies. So that's not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to go deep into that. But just so you know, this is the space that we're in right now. So when whoever's funding the trial, the sponsor decides that it would like to market a drug in Canada, after it's done the phase 3 study, or it might actually be while the phase 3 study is happening, it files what's called a new drug submission. And what Health Canada does is it reviews a whole bunch of information that's been submitted to them. They look at the safety of the drug. They look at how well it works in the area, the disease area it's supposed to work in. They look at the quality of the data as well to assess the drug's potential benefits and risks. And they also look at the information that will be provided to healthcare providers who might be prescribing or counseling about this drug in our case, as well as any information that is patient-facing. So they look at what's called the product monograph, the brochure, the label, etc. They review all of that. And if Health Canada has concluded that the benefits of this medication outweigh the risks, and the risks can be mitigated appropriately, then they will approve the drug. I just wanted to take a pause here too to note that Companies can do this in different ways. They can submit all of their information about this after the trial concludes, and then Health Canada reviews and hopefully approves it for them. But in other cases, depending on the situation, and this was the case with the COVID-19 vaccines, that the sponsors, the manufacturers, actually submitted and did what was called a rolling review with Health Canada. And a rolling review actually means that as data becomes available for the trial, it goes to the regulatory agency. And so the trial is like still happening, and Health Canada is actually reviewing the data. That generally allows because they're looking at things in parallel, it allowed, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines to immediately be approved once and become available like really quickly after they were approved. But that's really up to the sponsor in Health Canada if they decide that they do a rolling review or not. So in our case, we'll say with our amazing drug, it's been approved by Health Canada after its phase 3 study met its endpoints, and it becomes widely available. We can take it to market, and then what sometimes happens is that there are what's called phase 4 studies. This happens in the US as well. I know that much. And these are sometimes called post-marketing surveillance studies. So it's exactly what it says. This drug has now been approved to be marketed, but it's still kind of being watched in terms of what's happening in the population that it's in. And this is important because this allows us to look at long-term side effects of drugs in like large numbers of people. And once you get a drug into large numbers of people, sometimes side effects show up that weren't seen in the trials. And this has happened in a few cases. One well-known in the arthritis space where things have been pulled after they've been on the market because of some of the side effects that have happened. So like I said, this is when something gets into, like in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, millions of people are now exposed to the vaccines, and large numbers of participants in these trials. Also important for you to note that, if you are on a medication and it is come to market, but you have some type of side effect, you can report that side effect to Health Canada. Your healthcare providers can do the same. And that's part of their surveillance efforts also to see, how things are working after approvals. Okay, so that's kind of like did you know, here's a bunch of information for me to slop at you about how clinical trials work and like all the years it takes from something to be like a cool thing at the bench to actually getting into people if it makes it. Like there's so many things, honestly, that might happen along that journey that it kind of blows my mind that we actually have medications out there today, like given everything that they go through, right? So I just wanted to touch on a few things before I open it up broadly to questions about things I often get asked. So one of them is placebo, and I talked about it a little bit, but sometimes people are not sure what placebo is, why it's used, how it can be used, all those things. So if you hear about placebo, it basically is an inactive therapy that looks just like the active therapy. So it would be created, if it's a small green tablet, the active therapy, the placebo would be created to look like it's the exact same color, it's the same size, it's the same weight, it looks identical. But it's not intended to actually have any effect on the condition that's being studied. And just like randomization, placebo is used to make the results of the study more reliable. So if you've got two arms, you're giving the participants in both those arms what looks to be the same thing. And, nobody's reporting things differently because they're not being given, in our case, a small green pill, right? I mentioned before, but it's really important to reiterate that this is something that's only used if there's not a standard of care for the condition or the disease that's being studied. It would just not be ethical to take people off a standard of care and give them placebo. And so, again, important for you to think about if you're considering being in a trial. I get asked a lot too about, like, I've seen a clinical trial, but like, how do I know it's credible or reputable, or even like, if it's one that I should consider, right? So a couple of things to look at. One is that you should never be asked to pay for the study treatment. I recently saw this a few months ago where someone was interested in a clinical trial and they said, hey, would you have a look at it? The first thing that I flagged was that the investigators were asking for this person to cover the study treatment to the tune of about 5,000 Canadian dollars. That would not be approved. And that is something you should red flag if you're asked to pay for the study treatment, or if you're asked to, like, I don't know, if there's like an entrance fee to the trial, like that should not be something that you're asked. But there may be some costs that you would have to pay out of pocket. Like maybe it's for parking, if the trial is being done at a hospital. So maybe you'd have to pay for that parking out of pocket. You may or may not get reimbursed for that. There might be your time associated with participating in a trial. If you need childcare, again, those are all things you can ask about. They may or may not be covered, but like really big red flags if you're asked to cover the cost of the study treatment, or pay like some weird entry fee. The qualifications of the trial team are important too. Have they been working in this area for a long time? Like, do they have publications in this area? Maybe they're affiliated with an academic institution or a hospital or a site that does lots of clinical trials. So take a look at that and see if you feel comfortable that they know what they're up to. And then there's a number of different groups that will have had to approve the clinical trial, either happening at the site or look at it from an ethical point of view, or in the case of Health Canada, look at it, from a regulatory agency perspective. So has it been approved by, in our case, Health Canada, the regulatory agency? Has it been reviewed and approved by a research ethics board? And has it been reviewed and approved by where it's taking place? Because ultimately they're liable for what happens on their premises. Any of these questions should not be a big deal for you to ask the clinical trial team. If they are, that's another red flag that you're questioning them about this stuff, which is all pretty standard. And they shouldn't berate you for doing that. They shouldn't be surprised if you're doing that, and they should have the answers readily available. If you're given for example, the informed consent form to have a look at if you're interested in this study, it should have right on it that it's been, what ethics board has reviewed and approved it. Often the chair's phone number, contact information is provided, so you could always contact that person as well. So those are a few things to look at. The other question I get asked is like, do I have to go on a clinical trial? And the answer is no, of course you don't have to. It is an option that you may be interested in. There might be other options, and they may have their own potential risks and benefits that you'd have to weigh out for yourself. So maybe your option is receiving no treatment, which may or may not be a great option for you. Maybe your current treatment just isn't working how you thought it would or should. So maybe it's about looking at a different form of treatment. Maybe you're just interested in participating in a research study. It may not even be a clinical trial. So these are all things for you to think about, for you to maybe have a conversation with a trusted healthcare provider, might be your physician, and to help you weigh risks and potential benefits if you're thinking about a clinical trial, a research study, etc. If your own healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial, you can absolutely say no. So you don't have to feel obligated to say yes. It's all a very personal decision for you to be making, and your relationship with that individual should not change. And hopefully it doesn't, to be quite honest with you. There's this really important concept and process that's called informed consent that I just wanted to spend a couple minutes with you on as well. So as I mentioned, if you're offered a clinical trial, you don't have to say yes. Your consent and your decision is completely up to you. And even if you decide, yeah, I'm going to participate in a trial, and you've been in it for a few months and you decide, you know what, this isn't working for me. I've got this other stuff going on, or whatever your reason is, you can withdraw your consent at any time for any reason. And important to know that informed consent isn't just signing a form at the start of the study. It's actually this ongoing process throughout your participation. So you should feel like you can ask any kind of question. You should feel that you understand what's going on and what your roles and responsibilities are as part of the study. And you should know who to contact if you have any questions or concerns about it. If you do decide to leave a trial, you can request that any of the data you've provided, or if you've shared any kind of biological materials like blood, urine, tissue, whatever that is, you can ask for it to be removed from the study as well. That may or may not be possible for a number of reasons, but you can certainly ask for it. I've mentioned a few times there are potential benefits and potential risks to participating. And whatever the known ones are will be different for each clinical trial and will be described in the informed consent form. I mentioned previously, it's a personal decision for you to weigh those potential benefits and risks. What works for you in a trial might not work for somebody else in a trial. And so it's really an individual decision. And again, this is one of those things where you should ask as many and all questions about things, both about potential benefits and potential risks, until you feel good about the answers that you're receiving, till you feel good enough to make a decision for yourself. It's all about being informed, and it's all about you knowing what's right or not right for you. And that might be participation or it might not be. And I'm just going to end on the fact that because this is so important, you can leave a clinical trial. That's called withdrawal. You don't have to give any reason, and you might be asked for one, but you don't have to give any kind of reason. You should, ask any and all questions, just like you have throughout the informed consent process, to make sure that you understand what might be required of you to safely leave the trial. Or maybe you get questions answered and you change your mind. Like, it's really up to you. But again, as being part of that informed consent process, it's important for you to ask questions. And you might be asked to take some lab tests or some physical exams before you completely leave the trial, and that's for your own safety, so that the study team is feeling good about you leaving the trial safely. And I mentioned before, you can ask for your data, any samples to be removed from the study, but that may or may not be possible. So that's it for me. I thought we'd just revisit the knowledge poll. I know I blasted a ton of information at you, but I always hope that somebody takes away like at least one thing from a webinar. So let's put up the poll and we'll see if people are feeling just as knowledgeable at the start, or maybe some of you are feeling a little bit better, that you know a little bit more about what trials are. So feel free to go ahead and put your response in, and we'll see if we've shifted anything here. Although I know many of you felt like you knew a bit about things, but maybe some of you want my job, and that's okay. If you feel like you know a lot more than when you started, that's cool. So hopefully you've had a chance to put in your response. And maybe let's take a look at what the results are. Okay, amazing. About 40% of you want my job now, so that is excellent. And it looks like whoever wasn't sure about trials before now feels like they know a little bit. So I love that we've moved the needle even a tiny bit for a few of you. That's well, more than a tiny bit, because 38% of you want to do the presentation. So I am pleased to no end with that. I just want to leave you with my information. So if you're like me, I don't ask questions at the webinar, and then I'm like, oh, I have this great question. Where can I get a hold of that person again? So that's my my email address at CTO, and I'll put it in the chat too, so you can feel free to contact me at any time. And Lori, did you just want me to put up the slide about how people might be involved next? And I will start off with things with CTO. So from time to time, we have opportunities for people to be engaged with me at CTO, and signing up for a newsletter is a good way to find out about those opportunities. Sometimes we do workshops for the broader public too. So I'll leave it at that. And I'll pass over to Lori and Adam to wrap things up, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Yeah, and we regularly, share information with people with arthritis and have some opportunities to be engaged. We are, for example, offering another webinar. Hopefully I'll have the information confirmed over the next few weeks, but we'll be bringing someone in from Health Canada, for example, to speak about the regulatory approval process. So part of that is just some of the opportunities that we share, as well as if you live with arthritis, because I know this topic broadly applies to so many different health conditions and patients. We also offer education on that, and there's different opportunities to get involved. So I'd suggest just signing up to our newsletter, which is on the homepage of our website. And over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Dawn. Same here. I would just say ditto. We have tons of resources for on all of our various websites. Everything is free. Please do sign up or register. There's many different newsletters also that you can subscribe to through ghlf.org. If you scroll down, you'll see the subscribe button. We have a huge podcast network. You can subscribe to any of those. Some are condition specific, some are not condition specific. Feel free to explore those as well at ghlf.org/listen. And I will try and get to a couple of questions before we leave. And I think the first one, Dawn, that's most important from an audience member potentially would be, where do people find clinical trials if they're interested in one? If they live out of a province, can they still participate in one that they're interested in out of province?
Yep, that's a great question. So I'll put a plug for Clinical Trials Ontario has built a clinical trial finder, and I know CAPA's got it on their website also. It actually pulls from a large global database out of the US, which is clinicaltrials.gov. But we've worked with patients as partners to just make the interface a lot easier to use. So at the very least, you have to put in the condition that you're interested in that database. And then you can search for a trial in like within a few kilometers of your house. You can put that in, or you can search by province, territory, or all of Canada. If you're interested in something outside of Canada, we might open it up, but you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and it's one of the more comprehensive databases. If a trial isn't close to you, you still can participate, but that's something you should reach out and ask the trial team about. Sometimes the National Institutes of Health in the US actually runs trials, and they will pay for the travel and expenses of people from out of country to be involved. Some other trials might. That's it doesn't happen a lot, so it's really up to you to ask questions about it. I do know some patients who have paid for their own travel. They've had the luxury of being able to do so, or maybe it's not the luxury, they felt like they had to do so. And I'm sorry that that's what it comes down to for them, but there may be some options if something isn't close to you and you're still interested in participating. So kind of a wishy-washy answer. I'm sorry, Adam, but it really depends on the trial. It really depends on who the sponsor is, so who's paying to put the trial on. Or even, you can wait until sometimes if you see something happening in the US, it may come to Canada at another time. I've known someone who waited for that to happen and it did happen. Or just reach out to the trial team and ask questions about it and see what you can do about it.
Thanks so much, Dawn. And I know we're a little over time, but I do have just a couple more quick questions if you do have time. Just from another audience member, in terms of adverse effects, how many people need to be affected for the trial to be shut down, and who determines which effects should shut a trial down?
Yeah, that's really going to be trial dependent. And there are a number of different people and organizations that monitor the study. So, and something I didn't touch on is trials can shut down because of negative consequences, but they can also shut down because of positive consequences. So if something is happening where there's like this massive signal that whatever is happening is like really good, and it's actually unethical to continue the trial because the results are so good, that has happened before. So for example, there are groups that follow and that are part of putting on the trial that keep a close eye on if there are positive or negative side effects, so to speak. They will be the first ones to kind of be alerted to the fact that something good or bad is happening. And then there will be a protocol to follow in terms of what's happening. So we often think about if something bad happens in a trial, but sometimes a trial stops because actually really good things are happening too.
That's always positive
Yeah.
if something stops because of really good news. And I know we're over time, but just maybe one more question before we really wrap things up. What about drug interactions with current treatments people are taking? Are drug interactions researched during the drug discovery and clinical trial process? That sort of thing. And maybe who does that? Is it up to the patient to alert someone, or would the clinical trial, or the person running the clinical trial ask them more actively, what current treatments they're taking?
Yeah. So sometimes when people are undergoing what's called screening to participate in a clinical trial by the trial team, that's in order to determine whether or not they're actually eligible to participate in the trial. So even if someone's really interested in participating in a trial, you'll have to undergo screening to make sure that you can participate. And sometimes when you're on certain medications, you won't be able to participate. And that's again because in efforts to make sure that they understand the results are due to what's undergoing the clinical trial, so the drug of interest in the clinical trial, and not because of an interaction or some other thing that's happening. So for lack of better words, people might be excluded from the trial who are taking a current medication or have taken a medication in the past to keep the results as, quote, clean as possible. So for some of the big drugs, those tests will be done like really early on when this isn't even in people. And then, as the sponsor and the investigators develop who should participate in the trial, they will look at the list of medications people are currently on, et cetera. So it's actually quite complex, but that's a great question. I've never had that question before, just so that people know.
There we go. I'm glad we got to ask it. That was from an audience member as well. And again, I'm conscious of everyone's time, so we do want to wrap up. We didn't get to everyone's questions. There were some other really great questions, but please note that we're offering definitely written answers to those questions. So we can always follow up with the questions that were not answered, and send you a few more that actually maybe Lori and I had ourselves. So with that, again, I just wanted to thank Dawn for the really excellent presentation, and to everyone who's tuned in, I really hope you all learn more about clinical trials. According to our poll, it seems like we all did. And just to know that there are organizations like GHLF and CAPA and Clinical Trials Ontario that are really here for you, to help you understand your options and make sure you feel as informed as possible if you are interested in participating in a clinical trial. So over to you, Lori.
Yeah, no, thank you. I might just keep it super brief. And Don, I hope you don't mind because we do have a few more questions. Maybe we could just put it in the description, or I'll follow up with all the participants as well with the link once we sort of clean up the webinar and the ends and that sort of thing. Because I think there were some really good questions. So I appreciate that. And just thank you so much, Don. I always learn something new every time I hear you talk. So, and I think many in our audience had also reinforced that. So I just really thank you for taking some time out on a Saturday to help educate us about the drug discovery and the clinical trial process. So hopefully we'll see some more opportunities too for patients to get involved and to share their views through these different phases. So thanks so much.